Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way. This is a podcast for serious writers who want to develop their skills in artistry and stand out in a crowded industry by taking intelligent, creative risks. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I hold a PhD in literature. I'm the author of numerous books, and I take a very analytical approach to art making, emphasizing both efficiency and experimentation. Today I want to talk to you about experimental art. I'm going to be shifting the focus of this podcast and my blog a bit more fully towards experimental art making, experimental writing. You know, the actual topic of this podcast, writing the wrong way. All the different ways in which you can, not just work as a sort of general artist in a productive manner. I mean, I'll still talk about that stuff sometimes, but I want to shift the emphasis a bit more fully towards the thing that I'm a bit more of a specialist at, which is writing in an experimental manner or using experimental techniques in art making, and then additionally editing. Getting into editing approaches a bit more fully and more in depth. The sort of core things that I do. Of course, I'm a writer who writes a lot of things, and I am pretty productive given the limitations on my time, being a stay-at-home dad, and also having another job, teaching, part-time job teaching. And then at the same time, of course, I'm a writer, and I'm doing all this, other stuff like this podcast you're listening to. I'm a pretty productive person overall. But my specific specialties are not really in productivity so much as experimental art making. That's sort of my PhD is in creative writing and also literary theory, and my emphasis in the PhD program was on kind of experimental or avant-garde, innovative art making. Now, there's no real good word for experimental art. I use experimental, but I don't like it, frankly. There's a lot of problems with it. I'll get into actually today the problems with naming the kind of art making that I'm talking about, the problems with the word experimental, and the problems with some of the other terms. For lack of a better word, because I honestly don't believe there is a better one, I use experimental. So just because my focus, again, as the title Writing the Wrong Way might imply, is on trying to do things a little differently and in taking an unconventional approach, and in doing so, sort of separating yourself from others a little bit, separating yourself from the crowd somewhat. I think this is a good technique for an artist in a general sense. I think it's how artistic development happens, across a field. I think that the art world moves forward and the artistic discipline develops as artists, individual artists, and groups of artists break from convention and try to do things differently. I think the only way that really happens is through experimentation. So I have a great emphasis on experimentation. You may have also noticed when I talk about productivity issues or just general working issues, even then my emphasis in many ways is on experimentation, trying different things, seeing what works for you, not necessarily operating in line with conventional wisdom, but trying to try different things and move forward. The other thing that, of course, I want to get more fully into, which is not going to be the topic today, but in future podcasts, is editing. I do work also as a freelance editor, of course. You can hire me to freelance edit your work, just as you can hire me to write something for you, like theoretically at least. And I take a really kind of specific and in-depth approach to the editing process that is really structural and really a bit unusual compared to what other writers and editors I see are doing. I do a lot of editing, for example, on a structural level, not really looking at the words. In fact, most of the real core editing I do, it does not involve looking at the manuscript. So it's a certain type of kind of rigid, substantive editing that I've kind of developed a system for. So I'm going to talk more about that in other podcasts. That's not the topic today, but it is something I just want to say. Again, I'm moving kind of closer towards. Again, these two things are a bit more my specialty. And so I just want to spend a bit more time on them as this podcast develops. Today I want to talk about experimental art experimental writing and just what it is. Because there are a lot of terms for what I would call experimental art or experimental writing. There's not really a good adjective, like a good name for it. There's no good name for experimental art. Many people object to the scientific term experimental, claiming that either science has a capitalistic classism, which I think there's a good argument for, although I don't quite buy that argument, or that art should not be reduced to a form of knowledge production. And so again, there's a sort of interesting argument along those lines. But I want to get kind of more fully into like what experimental art is, not just in terms of like what things do we call experimental art, but just fundamentally, structurally speaking, like what is experimental art? When we're talking about it, when I say, I want to talk about this experimental book, what do I mean? I think that it is a term that is not really clearly defined. People just tend to use the term to apply to whatever they want to apply it to. But I think there's a very rigid way in which it should be applied. So you don't have to agree with me on this, but this is how I use experimental art, the specific coordinates of what I think avant-garde or innovative or experimental or radical art are. So I'm going to get a little bit into what is experimental art, what word maybe might we use. I think this artwork has become mainstreamed in a certain sense. You can even pick up a Dan Brown thriller and see various experimental techniques in play. So the a novel Angel and Demons, for example, by Dan Brown. Although I wouldn't say it's a great novel in many respects, it is nevertheless an interesting book insofar as it actually uses ambigrams. And name me another book at all that uses ambigrams. An ambigram, by the way, is an image that is a word, so it's a bit of a concrete poetry technique in a sense, and it's an image that is a word that can be read backwards and forwards, upside down, right side up, and it looks exactly the same. So those are ambigrams, and Dan Brown uses these extensively, or not extensively, but he does use them, kind of prominently in Angels and Demons. I don't think anyone would call Dan Brown an experimental author, but he does take a number of things that sort of are in line with this concept of writing the wrong way. So I just use that as a quick example. I'll talk more about that in maybe in another podcast, but just to use Dan Brown as a really quick example of somebody who's using experimental art techniques. But I want to call what he does experimental art. Just like you can be using horror elements, you can have a zombie in your story, but not necessarily be writing a horror story. Horror is a certain genre that has really specific things that it does, but it also has these elements. Zombies are a horror element, but you can imagine a romance story that features a zombie. In fact, I've seen numerous ones. Fido is a Canadian example. The author Jason has a really interesting book called now I blanked on the name of it, but Jason has a book about zombies that are kind of fall in love. It's weird love story zombies. So those are stories that are, again, they're romance, love story dramas, but they're not horror stories. They just have this horror story element. Similarly, again, we see experimental techniques in all sorts of mainstream places, but we don't necessarily see experimental art all the time, although we do have moments where it does hit the mainstream. The Weeknd has a certain songs that I would say classify, at least partially, as experimental art, as does the rapper Future. Even to some degree, a song like Lil Uzi Vert has a song that is now I'm just blanking on the only Lil Uzi Vert song I like is this song that I'll put in the show notes. I'll remember it later and I'll put it in the show notes. The show notes are available at jonathanball.com/23. So again, jonathanball.com/23. You can read the kind of scripted version of the little essay that I'm going to give you now on what is experimental art and why should we care about it, maybe what words might we use, and so on. So jonathanball.com/23 for all that information. But as I say, just to dive in, no good name for experimental art exists. People object to the term experimental often because of the scientific basis of it. They just don't like the tone or some ideological aspect of the scientistic term. Less grandly, but I think a little more eloquently, filmmaker Guy Maddin once said to me that he objected to the term experimental when people called his work experimental because it annoyed him, because he wasn't experimenting. He was actually doing things. And I thought that was the best objection. Although I still use the term experimental, I think that is in some ways the best objection to it. Your experiments are sometimes not just experiments, like you're actually doing things often as an experimental writer. But it still is the term that I think is the most neutral in a certain respect. And so I do tend to use it. It also is something that people will Google. So, there's a certain value to it as a kind of keyword, let's say. Some people speak of innovative art. I hear that term a lot. My joke is that they only use experimental artists say innovative art when they want investors, because it has this, very business-like connotation that I don't think is usually in line with the goals of experimental art. So it's, a good way to brand experimental art, I guess, just to call it innovative. I've done that from time to time, but for the most part, I think experimental is more accurate. Radical is maybe the term that best captures the spirit of experimental art, but I think radical connotes or suggests a progressive politics. And often experimentalists in history have been straightforwardly fascist, or even, more minimally have been reactionary or conservative. I don't think there's anything in experimental art that necessarily implies that it is progressive in its politics, although of course it can be. You hear the term avant-garde a lot, the militaristic term avant-garde. I think it is a good term in a sense that it implies an artist who's at the forefront of social change. But I think in some ways I avoid avant-garde just because it's a bit of a quaint anachronism in my view. This is an era where everyone's an artist and nobody cares. So the idea of an artist being at the forefront of anything socially, I think, is a little grandiose. Again, I don't object to these terms necessarily. I think the most precise term I've actually heard is from Gregory Betts, who wrote a book called Avant-Garde Canadian Literature. It's an academic book. And in Avant-Garde Canadian Literature, he uses a term that I believe he invented. I can't quite trace its precise origins, but the term he uses for today's experimentalism is post-avant. So sort of a post-avant-garde. Now, I think that in some ways that is the best term because it refers, and this is, here I'm quoting Betts, it refers, quote, to experimental modes of art making that challenge the various hegemonies of neoliberalism and modernity, but without much tangible faith in progress or revolution, end quote. So I like that, but, nobody uses the term post-avant. That's what it boils down to. I think is the best term is post-avant art. Nobody uses it. So I've kind of defaulted to experimental. Whatever you want to call it, though, experimental art has mainstreamed itself in many respects. There's a great poet turned media professor named Darren Wershler, who, in a weird aside, actually mentioning Guy Maddin earlier, Wershler wrote a great book on the film My Winnipeg by Guy Maddin. But Darren Wershler routinely tweets out about hashtag everyday conceptualism. Hashtag everyday conceptualism. If you click on that, throw that into Twitter, you'll find a whole bunch of obsessive practices or projects that in a bygone age, like in the past, would have been only the domain of conceptual artists, but now are things that kind of regular people are doing. You see experimental influences or even just straight up experimental art mainstreaming itself, whether in trap music in many respects, Griffin Poetry Prize shortlists here in Canada. Experimental art is appearing everywhere in some form. Andy Warhol might as well have predicted that in this future we would all be experimental artists for 15 minutes before we became bored and went out for avocado toast. Or maybe just professionalized ourselves as bizarre and our bizarre obsessions as tech startups. So why don't we just drop the descriptors and call it art? If experimental art is so mainstream now in many respects, if it has taken over in certain domains in the art world in many respects, in the visual arts, experimentalism is in fact the mainstream. In music, we've seen with the rise of hip hop, a lot of experimental techniques become mainstream, and so on. Why call anything experimental art? Why not just call it art? Well, I think there is still a value to the descriptor. In many ways, that fundamental gesture of experimental art as a genre, let's just call it a genre, although I don't think it's quite a genre, but let's just think about it as that in a sense. I think the fundamental gesture of experimental art is different from the mainstream, even if it is in the mainstream, because the fundamental gesture of experimental art is detachment from art proper. Its most extreme form, therefore, is anti-art. The basic and this is my argument, my thesis that I'm going to throw at you, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking a bit through. The basic technique of experimental art is self-reflexive defamiliarization, which I'll unpack later. But the basic technique of experimental art is self-reflexive defamiliarization, and its goal is conceptual violence. So let's just talk about that term, self-reflexive defamiliarization. I know that's a mouthful, but all it means is that experimental art usually works to make art strange. So that term defamiliarization comes from a Russian theorist, Viktor Shklovsky, who wrote a 1917 essay called Art as Technique. And in the essay, Shklovsky theorized that, quote, "The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged," end quote. So poetry, I think, provides the cleanest example of this attempt to kind of take the world and take artistic techniques and take objects that we are normally familiar with and defamiliarize them, render them unfamiliar, so that we pay this additional level of attention to them. When Marcel Duchamp takes a urinal and puts it in an art gallery, buys a urinal at a hardware store and installs it into an art gallery as an art object, one of the things that is happening there, among others, is that this thing that we normally disregard and don't look at, as much as we can, we just disregard it, don't look at it, only use it, a urinal, now gets moved into a position where we cannot use it, we can only look at it, we can only regard it, in this case, as art rather than as something that has a practical purpose. And so there's a way in which we look at the urinal now as an aesthetic object, like a thing of potential beauty. Whether we find it beautiful or not, we're being asked to consider it in that term, along those lines. And so that's the basic technique of defamiliarization. The technique, or any number of techniques, are being used in art making to perform that sort of an operation. Even if you're just writing description in a novel, you're describing a blue hat. Well, you describe that blue hat in a way that pulls it kind of into perception and prolongs our exposure to it. You're using all sorts of artistic techniques often to describe the thing in a way that makes the reader pay attention to it. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother to describe it. Once you start describing it in any number of ways, again, any number of techniques, almost all of them are used to take that object that we might normally just look over or look past or simply ignore or just glance at in everyday life. But now in the novel, we're being asked to pay an extreme amount of attention to it, if only for a minute, if only for a few sentences. Poetry, I think, provides the cleanest example of this because form is foregrounded in poetry. People don't talk like poems are structured. As poetic techniques, including rhyme and including line breaks, poetic techniques in general typically produce this estrangement effect, setting poetic language apart from language as we see it elsewhere. Even in a poem that's using found language, moving it into this new context, the context of considering it a poem, and any other techniques you might use, like adding line breaks or whatever, All those techniques are used to defamiliarize the lifted language. Experimental poetry then, I would argue, uses poetic techniques in a manner that draws attention to the poem as a poem. So experimental art has this additional level, of this meta level, of drawing attention to the poem as a poem and complicating its relationships to its author, to its audience, to the tradition, or even just to the material out of which it's made, language in this common example. An excellent example of this kind of thing is the extreme example, but an excellent example also is B.P. Nichol and his translation, quote unquote, his translation of Matsuo Basho's famous haiku. So, of course, the haiku originally is in Japanese. Here's a conventional translation of Basho's most famous poem. This translation is by R.H. Blythe. The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. So that's the traditional kind of translation of the Basho poem. Here's B.P. Nichol's translation. He did a few variations, but here's his best translation. Q. So this is the letter Q, which he drew on a piece of paper. Now, if you look at the letter Q and sit there and draw the letter Q in your mind, or draw it on a piece of paper in front of you. Now, look at it. The circle is the pond, the old pond from Basho's poem. The line, the line of the Q, is the frog's trajectory. A frog jumps in the second line. Well, that's the line of the Q. The sound of water, the third line of the haiku, which is the sound of the frog's plop, of course, is the sound of us reading the letter Q aloud. Q. Q. Q is also, by the way, the 17th letter of the alphabet, which preserves in a certain strange way the 17 syllables of the haiku. That's his nod to the haiku structure. So you might ask, is the letter Q, just a Q drawn on a piece of paper, is that a reasonable translation of Basho's haiku? If you encountered, the letter Q just by itself, with no title, no commentary, me not telling you anything about it to contextualize it, nothing about the letter Q indicates that it should in any way be considered a translation of an ancient haiku. It's just letter Q. But, as you've seen, it could be considered a reasonable, even an excellent experimental translation. So I think the thing to consider is that the project of B.P. Nichol's poem, his Q translation, is not so much to offer a reasonable translation as to call into question the nature of translation itself. Set a Q against the entire literary tradition of attention to this one poem, this very often translated poem. So the core subject of Nichol's translation is itself, and its contextual position inside of literary history. Its core approach is one of making the letter form Q strange, making us look at a Q like it was some sort of cross between a comic and a nature poem, as if it was some sort of translation of this haiku. I think experimental art is best understood, therefore, as a subgenre of whatever larger genre it's parasitically infected. One that uses a specific type of defamiliarization as its core technique, a self-reflexive approach that has the goal of defamiliarizing art itself, making art seem strange and unfamiliar to an audience that's been jaded by exposure to the artwork. This is why I advise people to write and produce experimental art, because by its nature, I think an experimental artwork positions the author and positions that artwork as different fundamentally, but still of a piece with this larger literary history context. This creates, the common reactions also, though, of but is it art? The but is it art ? Reactions and debates. Now, these are really boring debates because the answer is always the same. Yes, it's art, but it's trying hard not to be art. Now, I mentioned The Weeknd earlier. When The Weeknd sings, quote, "This ain't no fucking sing-along, so girl, what you singing for?" End quote. Imagine, that's an actual Weeknd line. And imagine him singing that in a concert to the fans in the front row. "This ain't a fucking sing-along, so girl, what you singing for?" It's not an admirable interaction with the audience. It's not an admirable line in many respects, but it is, I think, of a piece with this kind of experimental art because it calls attention to the situation and the dynamics of the artwork's production and consumption. It's taking you out of that familiar scenario of somebody singing to you and you singing along with them as you stand in the front row. It's kind of a violent call to attention, but it is kind of calling attention to the situation and taking you out of the situation, I think, in a certain respect. We see the same kind of calling attention at play in the theme song to It's Garry Shandling's Show, which is a wonderful theme song, which I'll link to in the show notes. It's Garry Shandling's Show, where the theme song just talks about how it is the theme song to Garry Shandling's Show. Shakespeare's Hamlet, of course, is the most famous example maybe of this calling attention, the play within a play, calling attention to the situation of the audience watching a play. Again, I mentioned Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is the urinal in the art gallery. Anne Carson's autobiography of Red uses a lot of these techniques as well. Nicholas Q, of course. The list goes on. When we consider experimental art apart from its social historical context, so take it apart from the groups that may or may not identify as avant-garde artists, and instead just look at what it is, like its actual formal approach that these artworks are using. Whether they rise from the fringes, whether they appear in the mainstream, what we see at time and again, over and over, is the same attempt to make some aspect of the artwork unfamiliar to its audience and jar them for attention first, and maybe some grander notion secondarily. The grander notion, by the way, usually takes some form of conceptual violence. So this is the second part of my definition of what experimental art is. Its goal, I think, is conceptual violence. Now, conceptual violence has more of a ring to it than self-reflexive defamiliarization, but I think it's harder to define. The phrase contains two connected meanings, both of which I think are important to experimental art practice. One is the desire to uncover violence inside of existing concepts, where maybe we don't believe violence is inherent, and the goal also of doing violence to those concepts, breaking into them and breaking them apart. Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, famously said, quote, "The medium is the message." And that idea applies here, because so often this conceptual violence occurs on a formal level. So he also said this in his 1964 masterwork, McLuhan's Understanding Media. McLuhan writes this, quote, "The artist is the one in any field, scientific or humanistic, who grasps the implications of new knowledge in experimental art. We are given the exact specifications of coming violence to our own psyches from our own counter-irritants or technology." So he, again, singling out experimental artists in this manner, that they're the ones who grasp the implications of new knowledge and give us the exact specifications of coming violence. The reason McLuhan believes this is because experimental artists use technology wrong. Again, instead of using it for its intended purpose, they misuse it to reveal its unintended effects. Experimental artists draw our attention to its form, to the medium, more so than its content, the message, as their message. Experimental art works to uncover the violence inherent in its technologies and in how they are ordinarily used. So not just the coming violence, but current and past violence is the subject proper of experimental art. In experimental poetry, for example, the technology under discussion is usually language itself. A great deal of experimental poetry repurposes language to reveal undercurrents of violence in ordinary speech or in the specialized ways that we discuss certain topics. Even if the point of our discussions is supportive, the way we talk often reveals inherent biases and aggressions regarding what we discuss. Any poetic project that takes as its source material language shares this approach, intentional or otherwise. So often when we exchange language from its original context, the result is to reveal extraordinary horror in side language that we have hitherto accepted as ordinary. A great book in this vein is Rachel Zolf in her book Human Resources. It works this way. And Jordan Abel also has a great book called Injun. There's a great line, a first line of that book, or one of the starting line in that book is, quote, "All them Injuns is people first," end quote. It's such a startling line. It reveals so much doublethink, and he's lifting this line from found materials. The line inherently has all this violence and aggression against indigenous people inherent in that phrase, but at the same time it's being structured as a supportive statement. And I think so often this is what experimental artists are trying to do, at least experimental poets. Another common target of experimentalism is narrative structure. Often, narrative presents facts or experimental art will prevent facts or fragments apart from commentary outside of coherence. An often remarked maxim is that we tell stories to order the world, to shape its chaos, and to express our desires and make sense of things, realigning the messy world for our own comfort. That's why we tell stories in a conventional wisdom says. But less remarked upon, because I think it's a more disturbing idea to consider, is that we use violence for the exact same purposes. We use violence to order the world, to shape its chaos, to express our desires, to make sense of things to ourselves, to realign the messy world for our own comfort. The narrative act, I think, works in that manner. My book, The Politics of Knives, is about this very idea. How the narrative act has a certain conceptual violence, and even something as banal as telling a story of our day involves shaping its bare facts into a particular structure that invalidates other perspectives on events and supports particular political biases. A good deal of experimental art attempts to avoid the artistic conventions that the artist sees as intermingled with the ego's violent insistence of its primacy. Of course, not everything works that way, but I think that's a very common trend. The base level, I would say, of experimental art, in terms of its conceptual violence, is to violate ideas about what art is or should be. Maximally, the work will incorporate or attempt actual violence. Whether it's real or thematized, the violent refusals of experimental art and the way it calls attention to itself as art, and the violence that's so often inherent in the audience's interactions or reactions to this art, accounts for much of the public's discomfort with experimental art. And I just want to end, I know it's throwing a lot of large concepts out. I'm just going to let them sit a little bit. If you want to think a bit more on this topic and whether you think I have something here, again, go to jonathanball.com/23. You can read all this, and again, that'll give you the coordinates of what I would consider experimental art and why I consider this experimental art, what I think is interesting about experimental art, and so on. I'm just going to end with a really brief anecdote that I think is worth just kind of tagging everything with. In 1974, the artist Marina Abramovic laid a gun and a pistol, along with other items, on a table with materials that she invited the public to use on her body in whatever ways they saw fit. Now, nobody murdered her, although they did arrange the gun in an invitation to kill herself. And among other abuses, the audience cut her neck and drank her blood.